You know, sometimes the biggest turning points in history start in the absolute strangest ways. I mean, a conflict that would kill millions of people and completely redraw the map of Europe, it all began with an act so specific, so bizarre, that there's a special word just for it.
Defenestrate. It's a great word, isn't it? And back in 1618, it went from being some obscure term to the literal spark that lit a 30-year fire across an entire continent. So today, we're going to break down exactly how that one single act of political violence ended up reshaping the entire world.
All right, so let's set the scene. We are in Prague, in the Kingdom of Bohemia, which is a big piece of the huge Holy Roman Empire. And you have to understand the tension between Catholics and Protestants is just at a boiling point. It's ready to explode. So what exactly pushed them over the edge? Well, for years, the Protestants in Bohemia had their religious freedom guaranteed by this document, a letter of majesty. But then a new king, Ferdinand II, comes along. He's a hardcore Catholic, and he has zero intention of honoring that deal. So when he sends his governors to Prague to lay down the law, the Protestant nobles, they are not having it. They march right into Hodgtony Castle, have a very tense little chat, and then they throw two of the governors and their secretaries straight out of a third-story window. We're talking a 70-foot drop.
And this is where the story perfectly captures what the whole conflict was about. Because, believe it or not, the men survived the fall. Now, if you're a Catholic, this was a clear-cut miracle. Proof that God was on your side, that angels literally swooped in and saved them. But if you were a Protestant, you had a much more, let's say, earthly explanation. They said the only reason those guys survived is because they landed in a giant soft pile of horse manure that had piled up in the castle moat. See what I mean? One event, two totally irreconcilable stories. It's the perfect metaphor for the divide that was about to tear Europe apart.
So that single act of, defenestration, it didn't stay a local problem in Bohemia for very long. No way. It was the first domino in a chain reaction that would get bigger and bloodier and more brutal for the next 3 decades.
You can really see how it spiraled out of control in these 4 phases. First, it's just a local religious revolt in Bohemia. Then the Lutheran king of Denmark decides to jump in to help out his fellow Protestants, and boom, it's a regional war. Next thing you know, the military genius Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden shows up. They called him the father of modern warfare, and it completely changes the game. And finally, in the deadliest phase of all, it just becomes this political slugfest between the great powers of Europe. With every single phase, the reasons for fighting got muddier, but the death toll just kept climbing.
8 million. That's the estimated number of people who died. Just let that number sink in for a minute. In some parts of what is now Germany, the population dropped by over 50%. This wasn't just a war between armies anymore. It was a war of starvation, of disease, of massacres against regular people. It was, without a doubt, one of the most destructive conflicts in all of human history.
And to really get a sense of the horror, you have to look at events like the sack of Magdeburg. In 1631, the Catholic imperial army stormed this Protestant city. And what happened next wasn't a battle. It was an apocalypse. The city's own mayor, Otto Guericke, saw it all, and his words just paint this picture of absolute, unspeakable chaos. Thousands of innocent men, women, and children being slaughtered in the streets, while their entire world burned to the ground around them.
The brutality at Magdeburg was so extreme, it created its own dark legacy. For years after, soldiers would use the phrase Magdeburg quartered as a threat. It was a promise that if you didn't surrender, no one would be spared. It became shorthand for total annihilation, a symbol of the war's descent into just pure savagery.
But here's where things get really interesting. As the war just dragged on, something fundamental started to shift. That initial religious fire, it started to fade, and it was replaced by cold, hard political calculation. The whole reason for fighting was changing.
And this gets us to the central paradox of the whole war. You've got the Habsburgs, who rule Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. They're the champions of the Catholic cause, right? Their goal is a unified, Catholic, Central Europe under their control. But then you look at their rival, France. France is also a deeply Catholic kingdom. But here's the problem. France is completely surrounded by Habsburg lands. And the French king's chief minister, a guy named Cardinal Richelieu, he realizes that a Habsburg victory, even a Catholic victory, would be an absolute disaster for France. And this is the moment everything pivots. Cardinal Richelieu, a prince of the Catholic Church, makes this stunning geopolitical move. He decides that the survival and power of the French state is more important than a victory for the Catholic faith.
So he starts secretly funneling enormous amounts of money to the Protestant armies of Sweden, paying them to fight against his fellow Catholics, the Habsburgs. It's a deal with the devil, and it completely changes the war.
This is a great way to think about it. During the Swedish phase, France was the bank. They provided the funds. Sweden was the army. They provided the swords. But after the Swedish king was killed, France had to jump into the fight directly. So in that final French phase, the roles kind of flipped. France provided the armies, the fists, while Sweden helped with the financial backing. National interests had officially won out over religious loyalty. This was a war about raw power, just cloaked in the language of religion.
So after 30 years of this unimaginable destruction, Europe was just exhausted. The continent was a smoking ruin. The conflict had burned itself out, and all sides were absolutely desperate for it to end. And it was that desperation that led to a peace deal that would literally define the world that we still live in today.
Now, the negotiations themselves were incredibly complex. They took years. But the treaty they finally hammered out in 1648, known as the Peace of Westphalia, it didn't just end the fighting. It basically installed a whole new operating system for how Europe would function.
And this treaty was revolutionary. First, it declared a general amnesty, basically saying, okay, let's just agree to forget the past and move on. Second, it expanded religious freedom to include Calvinists, trying to make sure religion could never cause a disaster like this again. But steps 3 and 4, those are the real game changers. The treaty recognized that the hundreds of little states inside the empire were, for all intents and purposes, independent. They had the right to control their own territory and make their own alliances. The old dream of a universal Catholic empire, it was dead.
And this is what gives birth to maybe the single most important concept in modern international relations, Westphalian sovereignty. It's a simple but incredibly powerful idea. Each state has total authority over what happens within its own borders. No pope, no emperor, no other country gets to tell you what to do inside your own territory, period.
And this is why it all matters so much today. The Peace of Westphalia is basically the birth certificate of the world of independent nation-states that we all live in. Seriously, the very idea of national borders, of diplomacy, of the principle of not meddling in another country's internal business, all of it traces right back to this bloody compromise in 1648. So, to wrap it all up, the 30 Years' War starts with a couple of guys getting thrown out a window over religion, it becomes the deadliest war Europe had ever seen, and it ends by creating a brand new secular world order based not on faith but on the power of independent states. It was the brutal, fiery birth of the modern age. And that leaves us with one last big thought. The system that was born back in 1648 has more or less governed how nations interact for almost 400 years. But as we face all these new global challenges, things that don't respect national borders, it raises a really profound question about what comes next. What kind of crisis and what kind of peace will it take to build a system that replaces it?